Good evening. I'm Don Levy. I'm Vice President for Research and National Labs at the University of Chicago. This is a unique experience for me. Of the introductions I've done, this is the first time I have not only been allowed to bring a beer up to the podium, but I was encouraged to do so. and since I always do what Lisa tells me, I did in fact bring my beer. This is the 8th in this series of joint speaker series, and it's been enormously successful from my point of view. I think from the audience's point of view as well. We're collecting a bit of a following, I'm pleased to say. So I see in the crowd many old faces from previous joint speaker series, many new faces, and I hope the new faces become old faces at the next one, because it's a very pleasant occasion where one can bring beer up to the podium and do that sort of thing. I'm here to introduce Mark Peters, who is the moderator for tonight's panel. Mark is the Deputy for Programs at Argonne and does many things in his day job as Director of Programs and handles many important things at Argonne, but I'm not going to talk about that because just being Deputy for Programs doesn't get you up here. You have to actually know something to participate in this panel. And Mark is, in fact, a recognized expert in the nuclear fuel cycle technologies and nuclear waste management, which of course will come into the subject of tonight's program. He's given expert testimony in front of Congress and has been called upon for formulation of policies on the nuclear fuel cycle. He was Deputy Associate Lab Director for Energy Sciences and Engineering at Argonne, and before that, he was a scientist at Los Alamos Laboratory. He's on a number of advisory boards and councils, and I won't list them all. I don't even think I know them all. Several of them support innovation and economic development for the state of Illinois, for Chicago, and U.S. industries. One of the things that Argonne has been trying to actively do in recent years is to broaden out and make contact with our surroundings, with the city of Chicago, with the state of Chicago, and having expertise like Mark on board makes it an easy way to do that. Before Mark introduces the speakers, we've asked him to take a minute or two to frame tonight's discussion. So with that, the floor is yours.
Good evening. How's everyone this evening? Thanks for being here. Great turnout. I really appreciate you being out on what's a little bit of a dreary night, but I think we'll have an exciting conversation inside here. I didn't bring my glass of wine, so I might have to, I'll see how things are going about halfway through, and I'll go back, grab a bottle, get you guys really moving. I want to, Don, thanks for the kind introduction, and I want to thank the university for putting this together as part of their excellent joint speaker series. This is, I think, a topic. It's a unique opportunity, these series, to bring people together from the university and the two laboratories that work so closely with the university to talk about hot topics around science and technology and the things that we think about every day. And today's topic is something that's near and dear to my heart and to many people, certainly here at the laboratory and at the university and at both laboratories, and that's the question of how do we build a sustainable energy future. When you talk about a sustainable energy future, I think it's interesting to sort of take a step back and maybe think about, what if we were having this panel 15 years ago, what would we think about? And so let's think about how you produce electricity. 15 years ago, nuclear energy was poised for what they were calling the Renaissance. I think we can agree that that hasn't materialized. Natural gas, which I think we're going to talk about quite a bit tonight, is currently a game changer, but the fracking techniques, et cetera, that are being used now to extract natural gas and heavy oils really wasn't in play in industry in any substantial way 15 years ago. So that's really a different world. Significant penetration of renewables. You heard a little bit about that in the video. I would argue it was a dream 15 years ago. It's still on its way. It's on its way. It's still not penetrating to the point to where it needs to, but it's certainly on a different path. And then fusion was 50 years away. I think fusion's still 50 years away, although Bob may try to convince us otherwise. So, and then let's think about how we use energy. Some interesting things that I came up with. there's been a real change in the way we use in demand. In the last 15 to 20 years, the amount of energy we use for heating and cooling has gone down, while the amount that we use to plug in appliances has gone up. Let's think about 1998. Only 1 in 3 adults accessed the internet. The iPhone didn't exist. Flat screen televisions were just coming on board, so it's really a different world. So when you think about predicting how you generate electricity and how you use it, I think it's illustrative to think about, would we have predicted that future? Probably, we probably would have predicted some of it, but not all of it. But that doesn't alleviate the responsibility of people at the universities and the laboratories to still think about that future. I think we need to continue to push to try to predict, to understand that future, understand the landscape today, and try to develop scenarios for that future. And so we have that responsibility to look ahead to the 2030 timeframe and think about it. What are the likely outcomes? How do we achieve that safe, sustainable, all the right words, economic, affordable, friendly to the climate, friendly to the environment, that energy future? That clearly it isn't one solution, it is a portfolio approach, that's clear, and I think we'll talk a lot more about that tonight. I think we've got a great panel set up to have that conversation. But you can't think about it sort of just in terms of environment or cost or economic security or energy security or climate or environmental security. You have to think about those in a linked way. And it's a really complex system. It's a fascinating problem, actually, for universities and laboratories to work on. And I think the research and development and the folks who analyze the energy system at the University of Chicago and at Argonne and at Fermi, I think are some of the world's best, and I think you're going to hear from 4 of them tonight, who have thought from their own perspectives in different ways about what that energy future might look like. So the format tonight is that I'm going to introduce the panelists one by one. They're going to come up and sit up here in front of us. I'm going to sit with them, and we're going to get much less, hopefully, formal. They're going to have about 5 minutes or so each to talk, provide some perspectives to start off the conversation, and then we'll have a discussion amongst the panel, and then we'll open it up to questions. So that's the idea. So we'll see how it goes. If we run out of gas up here, we'll open up to questions early. If not, we'll just keep going. We'll just see how it goes. But again, I think we've got a great panel tonight. And so what I'd like to do now is introduce them one by one and ask them to come up and sit here. So we'll start with Bob Rosner. Bob is the William E. Rather Distinguished Professor of Astronomy and Astrophysics and Physics at the University of Chicago. He's also the co-director of the Energy Policy Institute at the university and the Harris School of Public Policy. And we all here in Argonne know Bob quite well. He was our laboratory director, distinguished laboratory director from 2005 to 2009. Bob, welcome. Hussein Khalil is the director of Argonne's Nuclear Engineering Division, and he's also an Argonne Distinguished Fellow and a world-class expert in all things nuclear energy, advanced nuclear energy technologies. Hussein, please. Leah Guzowski is an energy policy scientist in the Decision and Information Sciences Division here at Argonne National Laboratory, and she leads the Building Energy Decision and Technology Research Program and also the Energy Security Team. Leah, please. And finally, Peter Littlewood is the Associate Lab Director here at Argonne for Physical Sciences and Engineering, and also a Professor of Physics at the James Franck Institute at the University of Chicago. Peter. So with that, I'm going to sit down, and we're going to go in the order that I introduced them. And again, they're going to spend a few minutes providing some opening remarks, and then we'll go into what we think will be a lively panel discussion. So, Bob, you're up.
Okay, thank you. So, of course, the slides are in reverse order.
Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Oh.
So, slide number 5. Okay.
We can adapt to that.
I think I can handle it. Yeah. So to start off, it might strike you a bit odd to start with policy. And if you had asked me this, 3 or 4 years ago, I would have agreed with that statement. It's a little odd to start. But when you talk to people who are actually in the business of energy, and you ask them, what do they need today? What is the most important thing that they need to accomplish over the next, say, 5 years? It has nothing to do with technology. It has everything to do with policy. The problem fundamentally is that if you want to design policy that actually executes, that is, it actually implements all the great new things that we'll hear about over the next half an hour, an hour, you have to have a political environment in which you can actually accomplish things. So first of all, you need a Congress that can actually pass legislation. You need to have a better understanding of what the future is all about. Mark just talked about predicting, and I think most of us who are in the business of predicting would be very hesitant to keep score of how good we are in predicting, especially in the social sphere. You know, the words black swans and unknown unknowns, a certain Department of Defense secretary was known to talk about that. They exist. So surprises exist. And unfortunately for us, it's the events and the tails of the distribution that matter. If you worry about the Florida harvest of oranges, what matters is whether or not there's going to be a killing frost early in the season. Just once, and the harvest is done. So the things that are hard to predict are unfortunately the things that matter, and the things that are relatively easy to predict turn out not to matter very much. So I have some examples up there just to give you a taste for what the issues are, and I can't resist actually going down a bit to the very last one, because Hussein is sitting next to me, and I just can't resist, okay? Sorry about that. So with the nuclear waste, I think most of you know that President Obama impaneled a Blue Ribbon Commission last year to look at the nuclear future. And it came out with a very interesting report, a very good report. I think many of us were extremely pleased by what happened. But something happened along the way. And what happened along the way, quite aside from the politics, is that 2 weeks ago, a federal court came to a decision. Turns out the federal government was sued by the utilities to stop collecting what's called the mill fee. The mill fee is the money that's collected from you and me to pay for the disposal of nuclear waste. It's 1/10 of a cent per kilowatt hour that those of us who benefit nuclear power, so if you live in Illinois, you're one of them, you've been paying this, and the amount of money that's in the nuclear waste fund right now is about $26 billion. There used to be, I think, something like 35, 36 billion, but some of that was spent on an experiment in Nevada, which hasn't turned out so well. Those of you who are familiar with the political process know that the waste fund is essentially inaccessible. That is, in order to get money out of the waste fund, the fact of the matter is the money isn't there. Actually, what's there is a piece of paper from the Treasury that says, we owe you $26 billion. So to get the money out, you have to go to appropes in Congress. You have to actually get the money appropriated. And in today's political environment, that's not going to happen. So how do you then step forward with the wonderful recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission? Well, you need the money, the mill fee, to pay for it. Whatever you're going to do, you need that. And the federal court basically said, agreed with the utilities. The utility said, you have $26 billion. What do you need more money for? And the court agreed. So, so as of 2 weeks ago, the utilities can no longer collect the mill fee. And if you ask how are we going to proceed, the answer is, I don't think anybody actually knows. So this is an example of what I would call unintended consequences. I don't think that the utilities originally intended to basically stop the process in its tracks, because it's not in their interest really to keep the nuclear material at the plant sites, which is what's going on today. I'm not going to go through all of them. Let me just give you one other example. An example has to do with wind and solar, which we'll hear some about. So it turns out that the Europeans are doing an experiment for our benefit. Not for their benefit, but for our benefit. Germany in particular has been very active in subsidies for wind and solar. And one of the consequences of that is that the price difference of electricity between day and night is disappearing. Why does that matter? Well, you heard George Crabtree in the video talk about storage for the grid, how important it is. And the way the Europeans have been doing storage is through a process called pumped storage. You have a reservoir, you fill it with water during the night when electricity is cheap, and then you let it go down through the turbines during the day when electricity is expensive. You know, the fundamental economic imperative of buy low, sell high. Now, In order to be able to do that, you absolutely need a price difference between the cost of electricity between day and night. And guess what solar is doing? It's killing that, because solar, guess when it's produced? During the day. So it turns out that today in Germany, not only is the electricity price increasing, most of us pay somewhere around the retail price of electricity here is, not talking about transport, but just the electricity price, somewhere around 7-8 cents per kilowatt hour. In Germany, it's 30 cents. So they're paying a lot for it, and the pumped storage facilities look like they're going to be closed down. So that is definitely not something that the solar industry intended, but that's what's going on. So with that.
Thanks, Bob. Hussein. So they're out of order. Sorry about that.
Well, Mark encouraged us to gaze into our respective crystal balls and do a bit of speculation about the energy future that we see. And of course, I have to acknowledge that it's impossible to predict. That's obvious. The future course of policy actions, business sector investments, and technology development that will drive the energy markets in the future. One thing that I believe is clear, though, is that the end consumers of energy products and services will, in the end, create a very strong pull for reliable energy forms, clean energy, and especially convenient access to energy that provides them flexibility. All this if it can be made affordable, of course. With more energy supply options becoming economical, and I'm thinking especially now of renewable energy forms, I could also envision a greater degree of customization of the energy supply and usage patterns to the local resources that are available in different parts of the world, different parts of the country. For example, it's very sunny in Arizona, it's very windy in Oklahoma, and so on. Of course, consumer preferences and attitudes are very different in different regions. And so I do see a corresponding need emerging for very versatile energy delivery systems and grids and energy supply to consumers. Mark, I also took it to heart your caution about making predictions and the need to be humble about making predictions. So I went to other people's predictions, and of course the U.S. Energy Information Agency and the International Energy Agency are in the business of making projections, and they talk about different scenarios, of course. But I'll just briefly summarize a few of highlights of the median of their statistical estimates. By 2030, they estimate that the total energy consumption between this year and 2030 will increase by about a third, from 550 quad to about 730, so that's an average growth of about 1.7% per year. Nuclear energy and renewable energy forms worldwide are the fastest growing energy sources. Nuclear worldwide grows at about 3.7% per year between now and then. Renewables grow by about 2.7% per year. But fossil fuels continue to supply approximately 80% of electricity through that time. Natural gas is the fastest growing among the fossil fuels, and of course supported by increasing supplies of shale gas and other unconventional sources, especially in the US. But maybe surprisingly, coal is not far behind, and mostly due to increases in China's consumption of coal. And coal use actually declines in the OECD countries to offset that to some extent. Oil lags to some extent, but also still sees some growth of less than 1% per year. And as I said, fossil fuels continue to dominate, and the projection for carbon emission is that it reaches 42 billion metric tons in 2030. And the projections are for the temperature the worldwide long-term temperature increase to attain several degrees, around 4 or 5 degrees C, which is well above the target of 2 degrees C. I need to turn now briefly to nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, of course, is I would say, the only proven, expandable, steady, and essentially non-emitting energy source. So it has enormous potential to fuel economic growth and development. There's enough uranium and thorium around the world to meet all the world's electricity generation needs for many centuries into the future. Nuclear is already used in approximately 30 different countries and accounts for about 13% of electricity generation worldwide. Several countries depend on nuclear to a much greater extent than the US. And a number of countries are very aggressive, expanding nuclear capacity. China, Russia, Korea, and in the future, India will join these. Also, as the slide shows here, the use of nuclear power actually is expanding worldwide, though its proportion of electricity generation has declined slightly, from a peak of about 16% to a current level of 13%. I believe this is temporary, and some of it is because of the post-Fukushima reactor shutdowns in Japan. The situation, well, let me just quickly mention in this chart, the countries in blue are the ones that use nuclear power and are expanding its use or planning to expand its use. The countries in green don't have nuclear power today, but are either in the process of introducing it or are planning, are in various stages of planning for its introduction. In the US, nuclear generates about 19% of electricity, but more than 60% of emission-free electricity. 20-year license extensions have been approved for most of the operating plants in the country, or are planned for most of these plants. After 30 years or so of no new plant constructions, we have a few new plants being built in the southeastern part of the country, but we're also seeing significant economic pressure from low-cost natural gas leading to the premature shutdown of some of the reactors. And so this goes against the trend of growth in the US. And as Mark mentioned, the nuclear renaissance that was envisioned about 10 years ago, and actually was about to get underway, has lost a lot of steam because of the reduced demand for energy, because of the high capital investment cost and the associated risk of investing in nuclear projects, and because of the domestic decline in the price of natural gas. And as Bob mentioned, nuclear power is also significantly handicapped by our national failure to implement a long-term solution for managing the used fuel discharge from our plants. I want to just quickly, or conclude by just quickly mentioning that we face additionally a number of international challenges in the nuclear energy arena, which are closely related to our domestic challenges. One of them being the risk of severe nuclear power plant accidents in other countries, as we saw at Fukushima and at Chernobyl before that. Another major concern is the security of nuclear materials and technologies and the potential misuse of these technologies for non-peaceful purposes, and the declining stature of the US as an international leader in the nuclear field. So as I indicated here on this slide, I really feel strongly that we need a very concerted national strategy and an action plan to bring about solutions in the national interest, assuring expandable supply or access to non-emitting energy forms, stimulating domestic job creation and energy sector exports, and fulfilling our goals related to nuclear safety, security, and non-proliferation.
Thanks. So I would note that I need to be careful. I used the word prediction, and I forgot who I was up here with for a moment. I'll blame the wine that I was drinking. So thanks for the comments. I'll be careful with my words. So Leah, please.
Sure. So I can't help myself, Mark, because I know that you like to throw out challenges to us quite often, and I thought to myself, wow, the future of energy in 5 minutes in one slide, that's a pretty good one. That's a good challenge, but I will do my best, and it is a pleasure to be here among colleagues tonight, so thank you for having me. I think we need to begin this conversation by talking about why. Why is our energy future so important? And frankly, science tells us that our human survival is really on the line in terms of the decisions that we make for our energy future. That's why it's so important. That's why we're all here tonight to talk about this issue. So you can see up here is my attempt at creating one slide that talks about the future of energy. Now, there are a number of things, and there's no way to really do this justice, but I honed in on 5 things that I think are very important that we need as we look towards our energy future. And many of us in this room are doing these things tonight. Those being discovery science, technology innovation, informed policy and regulation, entrepreneurialism, and engaged consumers. And most of us in this room are largely involved with these first 2. But I think we'll talk about a number of these different issues tonight. But these really aren't the things that I want everyone here to walk away with. What I really want you to walk away with is really what's in the images. And that is a picture of the Earth, our globe. And when it comes to energy, I think we have to think globally. It's not enough to think about our domestic boundaries and what we'll do in terms of energy. We have to be aware and thinking and looking at what's going on in other countries, and I know that we'll start talking about that tonight as we get into this discussion. Most of us all here know that what goes on in China, Brazil, India will have a tremendous impact on our futures, and the decisions that we make, vice versa, will have a tremendous impact on the lives of really those across the world. So there's another image here that I think is important to, it's not quite as obvious, but it's important to look at, and that is the image of a system. And I put that on the background of each of these different images. And that is because I think we have to think about energy as a system. I believe it's dangerous if we get too far honed in on specific sources or specific issues, we don't really start looking at the entire energy system. And I think going forward into the future, that is really the approach that we need to take. So what are the challenges and opportunities to get us there? Well, so look, the energy landscape right now is undergoing a massive change. I could go on for quite some time about all the changes that are going on. I think a couple of really important changes to note as we talk tonight, the US is currently surpassing Russia and Saudi Arabia to be the world's largest oil producer. Natural gas is abundant and cheap, as Mark alluded to. We will certainly talk more about that as we get into the discussion. Renewables are coming online. We'll talk more about that as well. And global urbanization is happening at a rate that we've really never experienced before as humans. We don't really know what to do with. So as we think about all these things, I think the unique challenge that we have tonight and with this audience is what is the role that universities and laboratories have to play in this mix? And I think we're very good about talking about what we do, and that's so important. And I love what we do here. I'm very proud of it. Same thing with our history. But I think going forward, we really need to talk about why we do the research that we do. And that's really what I'd like to talk a little bit more when we get into the discussion panel tonight. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Leah. Peter.
Thank you. So what more to say? We'll see. So I think I was thrown up here to cause trouble. So the first thing, since nobody has said this, I'll remind you of a famous sage who says, that it's really important not to try and predict stuff, especially about the future. And of course, while that's true, if you look about trying to predict weather, it's very hard. Predicting climate is completely straightforward. I mean, the prediction of global climate warming, the first and most accurate prediction of that was really made over a century ago by one of the greatest chemists who basically almost failed his PhD as a result of doing this. So there are things called sun rules which matter, and the sun rules matter over a very long time. And I think one of the things that I as a technologist feel is that technology changes the planet, politics influences it in the short term, but technology and science are what are fundamentally the drivers of our condition. We are about 2.5 centuries into the Industrial Revolution. Before that, we lived off the sun, and life wasn't terribly great. Once we learnt about water power, but unfortunately then rapidly coal and oil and stuff, that have propelled us to where we are now. But at some point over the next century or 2 centuries, I don't know how long it is, we have to make that transition. And I'm grateful that we have that long. Because the other thing that I want to do about lowering the tone is I want to talk about money, because I'm a theoretical physicist and we're very fond of money. So I wanted to start by looking about what you really want to do if you had renewables. So the first thing I'll start with, the title up here says that the average US energy consumption averaged over the year is 3 terawatts. So what does that mean? That is 5 billion microwave ovens running continuously. That's the way of thinking about it, 15 for every person in the US. How much solar energy hits the US? Well, actually, we get 300 watts per square meter. So if you ask how much that is, and you put it in Arizona, where most of it actually hits the ground, 300 watts per square meter hits that red blob. If you go to the next button pushed on here, the best laboratory efficiency photovoltaic we have is 30%. And if you were able to deploy that now, that would hit that blue area. If you take a solar furnace, which we can do now, that's 10%, and you're hitting most of Arizona. And if you take the stuff that you could buy on the ground now, it's a typical photovoltaic, it'll hit about 5%, and you're using a large fraction of the US. But the capacity is clearly there. That's a lot of area. I say 300 watts per square meter, 3 terawatts. The way of looking at that, that's the area of 2 small states in the US. It's it's 10,000 square kilometers, 100 by 100. So it's doable. Okay? But by the way, how much area of solar power have we installed so far? About 10 square kilometers in the US. So we have a long way to go. Now, by the way, suppose you did that. As it was pointed out earlier, it's only sunny during part of the day, and what do you do the rest of the time? You need backup. So if you take 3 terawatts, next click, and 12 hours, that actually requires you to take 3,000 Hoover dams. Because that 3 terawatts times 12 hours is 9 times the annual power generated by the Hoover Dam. Or another way of saying that is that that's 10 to the 8th tons of lithium-ion batteries, or current lithium-ion batteries that you can buy. That's a large amount. That's 1,000 times the world's current supply of lithium-ion batteries. So that's the template by which we live. And so what you should understand then, that even if miraculously somebody develops a cheap, wonderful technology, we're probably going to need a century to install it. It will take that long to get it going, and we're not close to that. So then I say, now down to the money. So the next one, how much does this stuff cost? And what I would remind you is that the technologies that we've been working on at the current time, and what I grew up with, are expensive. It turns out if you buy an iPad, one way of thinking about that is that's $1,000 a kilo, depending on how much memory you put into it. Or you can buy a 787 Dreamliner. I think they may have come down in price, but the last time I looked, they were $1,300 a kilo. That is what we call current high tech. A sort of a more reasonable price for technology goes by what economists, I'm told, call the hamburger rule. So hamburger, well, $10 a kilo, depending on the quality of it. This is high-grade hamburger. I didn't go to McDonald's for this. My car costs $13 a kilo. And that is pretty reasonable. Wind, we've heard, has actually made a lot of impact. Why? The reason is it costs $1.50 a kilo. And by the way, $1.50 a kilo, what does that actually mean? It means that you're actually very close to the cost of raw materials to build that. So steel costs you about $1 a kilo, aluminum is $2.50 a kilo. Most of the weight of that stuff is steel, aluminum, and concrete, and a few high-tech stuff, but it isn't terribly important. But if you get to $1.50 a kilo, you should then understand that at that cost, you get a recovery on that instrument selling your electricity to the grid at about 8 cents as you get your money back in 4 or 5 years. That's why the only growing renewable which is widely appearing is actually wind. I mean, George pointed out in his talk actually that renewables in the US have got to about 4%. It's almost entirely wind. There's very little of anything else. Even though solar has been growing very rapidly, it just, it's very far sub 1%, I mean, in this. So it's a very, very low impact. So when I think about science and what we need to do, if you think about the science that you need for photovoltaics, the science you need for batteries, it is nanoscience. The way we have traditionally used nanoscience is nanoscience to build iPads or nanoscience to build planes, and these things we generate at enormously high cost. We have to learn how to do the same quality of engineering, the same specificity, the same ability to control properties on a microscopic and nanoscopic scale, but we have to do it 3 orders of magnitude cheaper. There's no reason we can't do that. But it means that our science is going to change from science which is driven by high-tech labs to science which is being delivered in chemical engineering style ways of doing this. And I actually think that the future of science enterprises is probably going to be handed over to the chemical engineers actually in the next generation. So that's my thought.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so what I thought we should do is we'll come back to renewables and nuclear and everything, but you all kindly left natural gas out of your comments because I think I want to start there. So you can arguably, here's my perspective on natural gas. It's pushing, let's talk domestically first and then we can go to the globe, but it's interestingly as we find cheap natural gas, we're in a position now where we can be a net exporter. It's pushing coal out. It's probably slowing nuclear. It's actually making industry competitive in the United States again because it's cheap electricity and it's abundant. So energy security is a different conversation here in the United States than it was, say, even 5 years ago because of the natural gas finds. On the other hand, you're fracking, you're doing all kinds of things to the environment. On the positive side, it's actually pushing us towards meeting Kyoto protocols because it's displacing coal. But my concern is it's a bridge, but it's a very long bridge, and maybe it takes the enthusiasm out of the system to develop advanced technologies. I worry about that as well. So that's just my sort of some observations about natural gas. So what I'm going to start with you. Give your perspective on natural gas as it currently fits, and then how you would imagine it evolving with what appears to be a very abundant energy source, how it sort of evolves over, say, the next few decades.
Okay, actually, natural gas was on my slide, but I decided not to delve into it. And you really did raise the key point. So natural gas in the United States today costs less than $4 per million BTU. If you were to sell the same stuff in Japan, you'd be able to sell it for $17, $18 per million BTU. So the cost difference, the price difference, is just unbelievably huge between what we enjoy here as opposed to what, say, the Asians enjoy. Now, the problem for American companies, especially the energy producers, the companies like Exelon, Entergy, and so on, is, unfortunately, I hate to use this word, but it's going to come up over and over again, the matter of prediction. And the issue of prediction here has to do with, well, exactly how long do you think the cost of natural gas is going to stay below $4 per million BTU? It's an excellent question. Now, I can't resist making this point. We use two words that I heard here. One word, prediction, the other one, scenario. And let me just be very clear what the difference is. If you predict, the prediction comes along with an error estimate. If you have a scenario, it doesn't. Almost everything in the energy field are scenarios, not predictions. No one seriously does predictions because you cannot give error estimates. It's a very important point. So when somebody tells you such and such will happen in 10 years, what you should know for sure is that they cannot tell you how likely it is that what they said is true. And this is a conundrum that is faced by the energy companies, and is the principal reason why a company like Exelon is now in the business of actually closing some of its nuclear plants. They see natural gas as basically undercutting the profit margins on the nuclear plants. The CEO is responsible to the board and the stockholders, and think of how the stockholders view losing money on a nuclear plant. They will say, close it. Now, from the long-term perspective, most of us think, and I'm going to give you a probability here, that natural gas prices cannot stay below $4. They will probably rise to their historic level of maybe $8 to $10. That's very likely to happen, especially if we seriously start to export. And at that point, of course, this price competition with nuclear will no longer be there. However, that's a long-term issue. That's maybe 10, 20 years from now. And the question is, how long is a company like Exelon willing to sit there and get hit by losses on their existing nuclear fleet, given the fact that CEOs tend to be in their position for maybe 3-4 years, something like that. So their time horizon from the point of view of the executive is much, much shorter than the time horizon on which things actually will happen. And that is, I think, the principal policy issue and economic issue, that we're not very, very good at being able to respond to long-term trends.
Okay, thanks. Peter, I've heard you refer to the methane economy in conversations we've had. So.
Yeah, I think the methane is really interesting, as you pointed out. It's in many ways a huge surprise. You wouldn't have predicted this. Again, firstly, you start looking at this from the point of view of a scientist, and you say, gee, taking something interesting like that out of the ground and burning it is tough. Methane, just a bit of chemistry. Methane is very interesting because it sounds like it ought to be a great feedstock. But the problem with methane, about the only useful thing you can do with it chemically is to burn it. Because you might think that you would turn methane into methanol and then into something like alcohol that you could sort of bring up here on the podium. But that turns out to be an enormously difficult thing to do. Although, it's about time we figured it out, actually, because and I think that's one of the things that we should do. So, there are various ways of looking at methane. I would like to look at methane as a bridge which allows us to get through the 50 years of development so that we can get to real widespread use of renewables. Whether or not anybody's actually got the policy savvy to be able to make that work is an enormous challenge. The best thing I think that can happen for methane is that people do things which are really dumb from the point of view of the US. Somebody wants to make a lot of money at it, they will look at the price differential between the US and Japan, and they will export it. And the price will go up very rapidly. What would, of course, be very good for the US economy was that we wouldn't export it at all. We would use it to power manufacturing in the US, and we would repatriate large amounts of manufacturing work to the US. But I predict to you with 100% certainty that that won't happen. Okay?
And that's not a scenario. That's
And
not
that's
a
not
scenario.
a scenario. because the difference between 4 and 18 is too much. Somebody can make a huge amount of money out of that, and they will. So I actually think that I'm going to differ with Bob over this. I think that those prices stand a chance of equalizing very rapidly. Now, then I'll add one other thing actually about natural gas, because I come from the UK. The UK had a natural gas bonanza about 20 years ago, and installed a huge amount of natural gas capacity that basically kept them on the last round of Kyoto protocols. After you've done that once, what do you do next? Well, you install nuclear, actually, which is what as you know, is happening, in fact, in the UK. So globally, the US is in a very different place from lots of other parts of the world. I mean, we're, it's actually a lucky country. We have absolutely everything. We have an opportunity at the moment to have cheap energy prices so we could reinvigorate the economy with methane. We have lots of empty space and lots of space to improve our energy usage to get the prices down. And we actually have a level of technology investment that could benefit from new technologies far exceeding anything which could happen, I think, in Europe or Asia. I think the question is whether we get there and we use that, or whether our politicians screw it up.
Thanks, Peter. So you brought up natural gas as a bridge, perhaps a long bridge to renewables.
Yeah.
And I agree with that, actually.
Yeah.
Of course, I might add that it's a bridge to nuclear power.
Yeah,
in
so we'll
the
get back
future.
to that in a
At
second.
least as a baseload source of electricity, because imagining a grid with the kind of variability, and of course, energy storage comes into a real acute
Right.
need here with renewables, and I'm sure we'll get to that.
I'm going to come back to nuclear power. Just
Thank you.
Hold your horses just a little. So let's pursue the bridge to renewables, though. Leah, so what's your, I'm afraid what word to use anymore, prediction or scenario? Bob's got me kind of nervous.
Projection.
Yeah, projection, right. I'm just kidding. So what do you imagine the future of renewables? So right now it's all
Sure.
wind, right?
Sure.
And Peter articulated, I think, a very nice vision for how the R&D that's necessary to get to a renewable future. But sort of, how do you think about renewables in the future?
Sure. So I think there's actually a pretty simple answer to that in terms of the future of renewables is one, policy, and two, major technology breakthroughs such as storage. I think if we go back to talking about things like natural gas, clearly that is something that could tremendously affect our manufacturing competitiveness. And those are the kind of issues that I believe will eventually drive energy policy that may, in fact, enable different types of renewables, and it may complement the technology development that's going on here and at universities and so forth. But I think really without those two things, the future of renewables is, it's coming online more, as I remarked in my opening comments, but probably not going to be something that can have a tremendous impact without those two pieces. But that's really where I see the natural gas coming into kind of this bridge concept like we talked about. Is that something that can help drive policy? Is it something that can help us in technology development in terms of our competitiveness? I think with the natural gas question, we here in America and in most of Europe as well, there's potentially some really interesting infrastructure advantages that we have. We have infrastructure in urban areas that allows natural gas delivery. And maybe there is a technology that can actually fill that gap where, who knows, maybe there's a small gap. If we have that infrastructure in place right now, is a technology there that would allow us to then, simply use the natural gas that we have in our homes to fuel our vehicles. And that's something that I'm very interested in keeping an eye on. I think we see a lot of signs from industry that are probably headed in that direction. But I think we see a lot of the policy push will eventually feed into the renewables, but really without the technology and the policy, I think renewables will certainly grow, but not really become the major player that could ever really take on a significant baseload issue.
Real quickly, what do you think are some of maybe the sort of 2 or 3 technologies that need to come online to enable it?
Storage is clearly the big one. I mean,
Okay.
we hear the saying all the time that everybody just gets so sick of hearing it. That what happens when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. That's just the very obvious component, and that's in my opinion that's really the big breakthrough that we need. So hopefully our colleagues in the hub are working on that.
They're working on it.
That's good.
Okay, so now I do want to go to nuclear. So we're going to switch to as you know, you and I agree that it's reliable base load and it has a future, and you all both, Bob and Hussein, you both articulated there's challenges associated with it. And I don't want to make you repeat what you've already said, but I'd like you to comment on not only the near-term new builds, but also think about the next generation technologies and how those may be able to have a role in perhaps driving nuclear to being a bigger part of the energy system in the future.
Right. Yeah, I see the future actions and technology development in nuclear falling into sort of the near-term priorities, such as optimizing the existing fleet, which although they're struggling, especially where the electricity markets are deregulated, still they account for a very significant proportion of electricity. So it'll be important to optimize their operation and, to the extent possible, enhance what's now sort of commonly known as their accident tolerance. And there are some concepts for new types of fuels that can behave better under accident conditions, including very severe conditions such as those that were encountered in Fukushima. So I think that's important to keep working on the efficiency, the safety, and the economics of the current fleet. Also very important, though it's very much in the hands of industry, is to actually complete those 5 new plants that are under construction in Georgia, South Carolina, and there's one plant in Tennessee whose construction is being completed. But we need to do this without further cost overruns and time delays. They're frankly understandable because we haven't been in the business for quite a while, and so the supply chain isn't, hasn't been used for a long time. The new regulatory process of certifying standardized designs hasn't been fully exercised yet. So I'm not surprised to see some of these difficulties. And of course, all of us agree on this, that we actually need to advance used fuel management. There are no technical impediments. It's truly a question of political preferences and political disagreements. There are many ways we could deal with used fuel in this country. And I mean even in the short term, in terms of storage and safe short-term storage and intermediate term storage, not to mention for the longer term, more advanced fuel cycle options such as recycling and reusing the 95% of the energy value that's discarded with used fuel if we were to just irradiate the fuel once. I also believe that we really need a strong national program on advanced reactors and fuel cycles, and in part because the competition for nuclear energy is getting much better, and so we need to innovate in nuclear energy, and there are a few, I think, interesting directions. Small modular reactors are potentially a game-changing approach because they allow much smaller increments of capacity addition, and so they reduce the financial risk of investment in such a large capital-intensive project as a large plant. They also provide a lot more flexibility in terms of siting, in terms of applications, and the smaller size makes it much easier to move a lot of the work of building a reactor unit, to move it into a factory setting where you can improve the economics through learning, through having a much more controlled manufacturing environment than you would in a typical construction project. I think there are opportunities for nuclear energy to move into heat supply applications, including high temperature heat supply to various industrial processes. Hydrogen generation was of great interest, and I think will be again in the future, but other applications in the petrochemical industry, contributing energy to lightening heavy crude, for example, or extracting oil from tar sands, and so forth. And I really think an interesting direction is the possibility of using nuclear plants to generate electricity and a storable energy product, so that nuclear generators can use their output to make a product other than electricity when the price is low, because solar energy is abundant and the price of it is very low. These prices fluctuate tremendously during the day and from season to season, and this would be a big advantage if nuclear plants could.
Thanks. Bob, you've thought a lot, I've talked to you a lot about the global landscape of nuclear. Maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, so maybe what I can do is I can use what Hussein just talked about as a jumping off point to that.
Please.
So, Hussein mentioned the need to increase the R&D effort that we have in the States in new generation technologies, and I agree with that. But there is a policy issue there that is quite aside from the funding of the research, which actually will prevent any advancement here whatsoever. And we've already seen evidence of this. And that is the fact that the funding of the R&D component in the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has basically been decimated. The NRC is the part of the federal government that is the key gatekeeper in whether or not you can actually put new technology online. And at least one company, a company that's actually funded in part by Bill Gates, has already made the decision that the technology that they're pursuing, a new technology, the traveling wave reactors, that they will simply not make the attempt to get the design licensed here because they view the NRC as incapable of carrying the review out, and so they're negotiating with the Chinese. And I see that generally true. I think you mentioned high temperature, so we're talking about things like high temperature gas-cooled reactors or molten salt reactors, fast neutron spectrum reactors. These are all reactor designs that have not yet been licensed. You cannot put one online today. And the NRC is incapable of actually doing the certification. They don't have the R&D component. So my view is that unless there's a wholesale change in the way the federal government views these things and, for example, has an energy policy, we do not have an energy policy. We never probably have had an energy policy. Unless that changes, so my view is that the next generation reactors, the R&D is going to happen elsewhere with the help of people here. But the test reactors, all those things, where they're going to be built, they'll be built in places like India and China, in my view. And so here is the key point, is that they're not slowing down. I've been a few times to Chinese nuclear installations. They're not holding back. They had a temporary hold on construction because of what happened in Fukushima. My view is that this was largely an exercise in public relations, that they have no intention of stopping. They've gone right back to completing these plants. There are 27 of them under construction. There will be many more. So in countries like China, we will see there is a renaissance. There is a nuclear renaissance. It's ongoing. And by the way, is also ongoing in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese have ordered 2 Russian reactors, and they're negotiating with both the Japanese and the South Koreans for another 2. So that's the first point. The second is that I want to mention, I used the word unintended consequence before, and I just want to point out that sometimes when we think that we're doing good, we're actually not doing anything of the kind. Natural gas is a good example. A few folks here on the podium said that that one of the consequences of the resurgence of natural gas in the United States is that it's pushing coal out of business, out of the energy business. And that's true in the United States. Now you can ask yourself, okay, so over the last 5 years, what has happened to coal production in the United States? Has it gone down? The answer is no. Why? Because companies like Peabody are simply seeing this, they want to stay in business, and they're simply exporting the coal to China, to Japan. So in terms of the net CO2 impact for the world, the fact that natural gas is coming into the fore in the United States has actually not been a positive development. It's been basically at best neutral. So this displacement effect is something that's very important to keep in mind. We can pat ourselves on the back in terms of our own use, but in fact, that coal is being used someplace else. And those of you who've been through Portland recently have probably seen Portland, Oregon, may have seen the incredible unit trains that are transporting coal to the Portland port, where it's being loaded onto ships, bulk carriers over to Asia.
I think I heard a bit of a gasp from the audience when Bob referenced 27 new nuclear production facilities coming or being constructed in China. And I think it's important to put that in context of, I think the last estimate I saw was maybe 17 operational right now. And I think maybe something the last thing I saw was more in the upwards of low 30s. So I think that context of really only 17 working right now, and actually predicting if all of this actually does come online, looking at about a 200 gigawatt capacity by 2030, that's the global story.
Yeah, thanks for the points about globe, and you made it in your remarks too. It's very, very important. This is a global problem, right?
Yes.
And, so let's stay on global for a minute. I have a couple of topics I want to get out here before we open it up, just in case they have. And this is on urbanization, so I'm coming to you again, Leah.
Sure.
So when you look globally, urbanization, it's developed world perhaps less, but there will be increased urbanization. But in the developing world, clearly there's going to be a dramatic increase in urbanization.
That's right.
And also, interesting thing is the university and laboratory have a really, really interesting burgeoning program in thinking about urban sciences and all that goes into that. So maybe speak to us a little bit about sort of your vision of the future as it plays within urbanization,
Sure.
and also a little bit about the R&D that's going into it. That
Okay.
we're imagining.
Sure. So urbanization it's really not about the U.S. We have largely already urbanized as a country. And what we will see, as Mark referenced, as urbanization will increasingly, it will have a global impact. So what happens in China and what happens in India and what happens in Brazil, that will impact us. And one of the things that I'm particularly excited about working on right now at the laboratory is actually thinking about our capabilities that we have across different divisions and across different sectors, and applying that to urban science type of problems. And the reason why that's so critical to the work that we do is we're using all of our capabilities on specific problems that face urbanization. So instead of just thinking about, okay, we're going to work on any kind of given technology development, we actually want to look at how that then integrates into an urban system. I think we're seeing an increased kind of noise and traffic, if you will, around the whole concept of urbanization. And we're putting together some pretty exciting projects right now that I think speak to the scale and speed that urbanization is going on. I think the last estimate that I saw, it was approximately 80% or so of the new energy demand by 2030. It will come from cities and it will come from non-OECD countries. So it's there. And if we don't do our job as a laboratory and as universities to address that and apply our research to this problem, I think we're missing a really critical opportunity.
Thanks. Bob, did you want to say anything on that, or no?
No,
Thank you.
I agree.
Yeah, it's hard not to agree. Okay, so another topic, water. Peter, I'd like you to talk a bit about that.
Yeah,
so water,
but
there's...
before getting there again,
Yeah.
so in my role of troublemaker here, I wanted to say something about urbanization. And again, I'm thinking forward a couple of centuries. I'm not thinking about now. What drives cities actually mostly is concentration of resources and the difficulty of distributing them. If you actually get to renewables, the resources are actually distributed and you live where the resources are. So the thing that one could imagine, if you were hopeful, is that if you go to a country like India, where most of the population is still living in villages without energy, that you actually provide renewable resources in those villages, which you can actually do now even at modest cost, that you actually provide reasons for people to stay put and live where they're actually likely to be happier rather than moving to the slums that Asian cities typically are. I don't know whether we'll get there. I mean, I think the risk is that we'll flood into cities and a couple of centuries later it'll seem like a strange thing to have done and we'll finally move our way out again if we ever succeed in getting through that. But then I should turn to water, as I say. So, water is another part of all of this. So in terms of resources which are scarce on the planet, water in many places is a much scarcer resource than energy is. You tend not to see that actually if you live here in the Midwest, because we have in the Great Lakes 20% of the world's fresh water supplies on our doorstep. But in many parts of the planet that actually isn't true. Of course, what we do, of course, with the Great Lakes is to pollute them. and cause great damage to our environment in doing that. But one of the big issues about water, of course, is how you produce water with less energy, and also how you produce energy with less water. And that nexus, I think, is another great and important topic for both research, and it's research, as we've heard with all of these things, that spans from the fundamental science of water. How do you build better filtration systems? How do you get water more efficiently by desalination? To how do you distribute water? How do we live? How do we use water? What are the politics around it? What are the social policies around it? And it's a great thing, actually, for a city like Chicago to think about. And I suppose one of the things which is interesting about our discussion tonight, this is Argonne and Fermilab and the University of Chicago, and I think as Mark was remarking earlier, or maybe Don was remarking earlier, it's actually the city of Chicago. And the city of Chicago is a great experimentalist. I mean, an earlier discussion I was having actually this evening, which I'm now remembering, is what Chicago has done with water. A little over a century ago, we turned rivers in the other direction so that we could actually use water productively. We raised the city by 12 feet because it was actually built on marshland so that we could control it. And we've actually gained control of our urban environment around Chicago, which is historically built around water as our resource. And we've sort of turned our back on it, and we have to recognize what an important thing it is that we need to work with. So it's it is a big topic for research in all ways, and it's actually bigger than the kind of thing that any individual institution can engage with.
Thanks, Peter.
Mark,
Yeah, please.
I wanted to add that it's also a subject for engineering. In the case of nuclear power plants, it's perfectly feasible to design them to reject their heat to air, to use dry cooling methods. It just turns out to be not particularly economic or compact to do that, especially for conventional designs. So it's a matter of economics on the power conversion side of a nuclear plant. But along these lines, the small modular reactors actually lend themselves better to the dry heat rejection technologies, essentially the way a radiator works in a car. Also, high temperature reactors are better because the conversion efficiency, the electricity to heat conversion is better. But the other thing I wanted to add here is that nuclear and other forms of energy, of course, can be used to desalinate seawater. They can be used to purify unclean water, unsanitary water. So this illustrates the nexus even further. I think we have solutions, and the challenges are both scientific and engineering solutions to make them affordable and available.
Okay, thanks. So I want to turn it to the audience, but before I do that, I wanted to talk about the grid, but we'll let that's an hour by itself. So maybe the audience will ask about the grid. We can talk about that, or we can stay till midnight, one or the other. It doesn't matter to me. But I do. Before we go to the audience, I didn't ask you. I'd like to ask you all. You have a magic wand. What's the one policy and one technology that you'd like to have in existence today to transform the energy system? Bob.
Well, it would be great if we actually had an energy policy.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that.
That would be great.
I don't know what to say.
We're one of the very few countries in the world that does not. And it's telling.
Okay.
Technology, I confess I love nuclear. It's just a confession. And I wish that this actually blends into the policy area, which is I wish that we were not so risk averse about fast neutron spectrum reactors, because they are an important way of dealing with the waste issue. Dealing with very active materials is always a problem, and dealing with much lower level waste is much easier.
Okay.
And I wish we weren't so risk averse.
All right, thanks. Hussein, briefly.
I completely agree, and if it's easier to call it a strategy than a policy or an action plan or a program, we need a concerted national approach to energy and to nuclear energy in particular. It's always been in the national domain substantially, and we need a very proactive policy. In terms of technology, I actually think that energy storage at the grid scale is something that's really would be a major difference maker. I think we're very far from having something that works, and I think it's a challenge for the scientists and engineers.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Sure. So in terms of policy, it sounds like up here, I think there needs to be a concerted energy policy in the U.S. Lack of that happening, what I would like to see in terms of policy is energy more specifically integrated into manufacturing policy, for instance, because that's something that we seem to be okay with, and we actually seem to be doing a pretty good job on. But again, the national energy policy is certainly important and not something to give up on. But in the meantime, I think that there are pieces that we can still get given our interest in different sectors and not just specifically energy. With technology, the most obvious to me is efficiency. I mean, that's just kind of the first. You take a first cut at efficiency, and you get the technologies there to be a more efficient economy in terms of energy. And then I think comes storage, in my opinion. So that's where I would point my
Thanks, Leah.
my interest.
Peter, final word.
Yeah, sort of magic wand. I think I'd like my pension to be paid in kilowatt hours. So the reason for saying that is if you think, again, a long time into the future, you're trying to save money. You don't know how much that money is worth. I'm pretty sure what I'll be able to get for a kilowatt hour, what it will actually buy. What I really think we need to move around is to realize that energy actually is money. Energy, I mean, it used to be more than 200 years ago, the way you priced things was by how much it costs to hire a laborer for a day. And that's because you were paying for that work person's energy. And we have lost touch with that, and it's coming back to get us, and it's getting to the point where I think energy actually is money again. And so we should stop imagining that the dollar is worth something or that gold is worth something, and we should start pricing things in terms of energy. And that then, of course, means that there needs to be a real market for energy. And as my colleagues at the other end of the table understand, is there's no such thing as a market for energy. If there was one, I think some of these policies will be driven back into some way which has some sense.
And I have to add, I don't think it's just money, but I think that money is going to be increasingly a current in terms of our geopolitical situation. And that's really where that money really comes into play.
Okay, as the moderator, I'm surprised nobody said price on carbon, but you're not allowed to comment on that right now. So let's open it up to the audience. Is there questions from the audience? Is there going to be microphones, or should we just, yeah? Okay. Just wait for the microphone.
Yes, I have a comment and question. Comment I have about natural gas. At this moment is a cheap source of energy because of fracking technology. And fracking technology is actually like a Wild West right now, because that's limited regulation or no regulation at all. And as soon as we learn how much danger fracking is causing to environment and to our infrastructure, actually, probably it's gonna be a lot more expensive. Nuclear energy is the most stable energy, but it needs support of other energies, because we cannot turn it down a little bit or up. It goes on full cycle. So going back to storage energy, I didn't hear too much about the most renewable source of energy, which is water, actually hydrogen. Can you provide some more information about using hydrogen or going Argonne to work on new technologies involving hydrogen?
I first have to just make one respectfully disagree with your point about the price of natural gas going up given environmental consequences, and I think we've seen that story play out time and time again. And environmental consequences has not, in fact, affected price in many situations, but I'll let my colleagues certainly answer the question.
I could say something about hydrogen, I
Yeah,
think.
please.
So I mean, of course, we were discussing a bit the methane economy, and I guess 10 years ago we would have been discussing the hydrogen economy. I think that's what the question you're asking. So why haven't we got that far? I mean, I think a lot of it, frankly, is technology. Firstly, you have to make hydrogen from something that requires an energy source. And then you actually have to transport hydrogen around effectively, and we have had trouble doing that. If we had more effective ways of compressing hydrogen and transferring it, I think you would have seen it a lot faster. I think there's been a technology problem there that we have failed to solve. I think it could still be solved.
Yeah, and the infrastructure.
And we're working on it.
Yeah, the infrastructure related to even natural gas as a transportation fuel is also a challenge.
Also a
so
problem.
there's an infrastructure challenge
Sure.
that we didn't talk about as much as we could have.
One thing, just to clarify about the price of natural gas. One of the reasons that natural gas is so cheap is actually it's an indirect consequence of fracking, not a direct consequence. The way natural gas that's actually being sold today that comes from fracking, the way it's recovered is from what's called wet gas. Wet gas is when you extract from the shale not just the gas but also oil. And as long as the price of oil is high enough, these companies actually make the money on the oil, and the gas to them is almost free. So that is what actually is pushing the natural gas price down. It's the reason that many of the dry gas wells have actually been closed. They've been capped. They're not actually productive. It doesn't make sense actually to produce dry gas today in the United States, given the natural gas price.
Just wanted to clarify one point. In one sense, hydrogen is very different from natural gas. It's not an energy source. I think that's obvious. It's an energy carrier like electricity. It needs a source like water. It needs a tremendous energy input, and we heard about the challenges of storing it and distributing it.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes. Leah alluded to this, but this is an energy system. It's not just supply side; it's also demand side. And we really didn't talk anything about reducing energy demand. Did talk about energy efficiency to some degree, but with all the housing stock we have, all the buildings we have, it seems to me that there's tremendous opportunity for us to reduce consumption and demand, and that there's a lot of economic opportunity associated with that. And I'm wondering if we can elaborate on that a little bit.
So maybe I can speak to that a little bit. So I agree with you, and the extent to which you can do it in the States is actually illustrated by California. California has an energy use per capita that is starting to come into the range of what the Europeans are doing. Now they're blessed with a very nice climate, and here in Chicago we don't quite have the same climate. So we have another problem here, which is that the way that people live in the United States is drastically different from the rest of the world. We have, our population is really spread. For example, in the greater Chicago area, most people live outside of the city of Chicago. The population, I think, the metropolitan area is something of the order of 8 million, something like that, 3 million of whom live in the city. European cities are very different. European cities are much more centralized. And so all these energy costs, such as related to transport, for example, we bear them that they don't. And that's something that can only be fixed not by installation, things like that, but by changing the way we live. And that is a tall order.
I think if in order to change the way that we live, we do need to start to see some kind of consumer choice component to energy. Because right now, I think that the way that we are trained to think about energy is you rely on petroleum for your car, and you plug whatever you want to plug into your socket in your wall, and I would venture to guess that most Americans don't even know where that energy comes from or how it even works. So until you actually start seeing choices in terms of what American consumers actually understand and see when it comes to energy, it's cheap, it's easy, and there's really no thought that goes into the energy that we use here in the U.S. And I think until that changes and until there are actually choices and consequences that are visible to American consumers, I'm not really convinced that the efficiency will necessarily change unless it maybe is as simple as turning in a light bulb, but even that is, I don't know.
Yeah, the fact that we didn't cover it doesn't, I think, let me be clear, I don't think it's important. I think you get into how we use energy efficiency, demand response, the grid, and all of that. That's probably another panel, actually, a whole other panel. And then there's another panel on transportation. We didn't even touch transportation.
Yeah. Maybe one other thing to add
so-
is what Mark alluded to, which is the carbon tax or cap and trade, is part of a larger story, which is which it would have been number 2 on my list of things I'd like to see happen, which is that the energy prices actually reflect true costs, and they absolutely do not.
Okay, is there any other questions? Okay.
Okay, yes. This is a clean energy discussion, but may I ask a dirty energy question then, in balance? An interesting suggestion was made that one of the best things you might do with natural gas is burn it, because it's one of the best things to burn if you're going to burn something. I've thought for a number of years, I've always felt very sad, uneasy when people burn coal. Isn't that the worst thing you could do with coal? Is that not, in fact, a very valuable feedstock? So is there something that has distorted the market? It just seems like the last thing you would want to do, certainly in the long term, is to burn such a valuable thing.
So maybe I should answer that because I was the one who made that comment. Actually, what I really meant to say was actually it's very difficult to do anything useful with methane other than to burn it. So a bit of chemistry is just that, turning methane, you have to oxidize it bond by bond. There's a very large barrier to the first bond, but after you've done that, the whole thing goes downhill and the thing blows up. That's a piece of fundamental chemistry that we haven't really cracked. And developing good catalysts that actually make methane a useful feedstock and replacing the very expensive Fischer-Tropsch process that we actually have now for using methane is a really, really important science target that we should be addressing. So the problem is that we don't know anything better to do with methane other than to burn it, not that we should. I suppose the other thing that remembers, I think I'm here to tell jokes. I did once ask Steve Koonin when he was chief scientist for BP. BP had this time where their slogan was Beyond Petroleum. And we said, well, Steve, what actually is beyond petroleum? And he said, well, actually, it's coal.
That is kind of funny, actually. If you're an energy person, that's funny.
This is in the category of consumers having a choice. Sometime, maybe 3 years ago, we live in Hyde Park in Chicago, we got a letter from ComEd saying that we could sign up so that we would be, depending upon what time we used the electricity, like running the dishwasher in the evening or the weekends or washing machine, then we would be charged a cheaper rate. And so we wouldn't be charged the same rate no matter when we use the electricity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's made a big difference. I mean, I don't really track how much we use, but they send out letters probably 4 times a year saying how we compare to our neighbors. Well, we only have 2 people in our house, so that's pretty easy. But I'm sure that something like that, when people do have a choice, you can use electricity when it's cheaper. Sometimes you have that option. We don't have a baby.
I think that is probably a ways away from really taking hold in terms of you care, so you do it, right. But probably the dollar amount is probably not enough that would really significantly change American consumers' behavior, and that's what it's about, is behavior change. Typically what you see with these kind of incentive programs that they send out a letter and they say, you're this smiley face or whatever it is compared to your neighbor. Typically that's about 2%, which, that's not bad, right? If you can take that with a relatively simple measure, those are the kind of things that, why not? It's easy. There's really no technology involved or technology development. It's an easy first cut. But I do think that in order to have a more significant impact, then you have to start looking at prices that you see in the rest of the world and probably not 7 cents a kilowatt hour.
I can't resist telling you about this. So you may not be aware of the fact that if you've been receiving those letters from Commonwealth Edison that show the comparison to your neighbors, you're actually part of an experiment. It's an experiment that's carried out by a company called O-Power, which has a contract with ComEd to do a behavioral economics experiment. And the experiment is as follows. There are actually two versions of that letter. One has the bars, and the other has the bars and the smiley faces. Now you might ask, what are the smiley faces about? So it turns out what O-Power discovered is that if you don't have the smiley faces, then the people that do extremely well, you know, the ones with the little bar, they apparently say, oh, I'm so cheap, I might as well just use more electricity. And they do. So it turns out if they get two smiley faces, you might have noticed, then they don't do that. And the people in O-Power actually are closely related to U of C, to an economist named Thaler, who's one of the principal developers of behavioral economics. Is one of his students is the principal scientist of O-Power, actually. And if you read the book Nudge, it's all about that.
They've seen an income correlation too, where if you actually get into the upper level of incomes, the competition actually reverts back to wanting to spend more on your electricity or whatever the case is, to kind of show that you have a substantial house and you use a lot of energy. Right.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just to comment on that, there is something that we haven't talked about, which is actually the power of children. I mean, I've seen that used a lot in Europe, where basically kids are trained in schools to become green police. Because actually kids care about the future of the planet. We've only talked about money here. But they actually do care about real things like that. And they will come and they will shame their parents into turning down the thermostat and doing all of this stuff. And it turns out it really does work because people listen to their kids. You know, it matters. So
That's a great point.
yeah.
Other questions?
I have a question for the, well, two really. One, when you talk about nuclear power, and there's countries in Europe that do a good job, like France. What I'm curious is how do they address the issue with where does the spent fuel go, or what are they doing to address that? Because right now we really have no policy for addressing the spent fuel for where it goes. And the second question I got is more to the group in general. You know, we don't have an energy policy for the United States, and part of that's because of our recalcitrant Congress. How do individuals like you or who know that this is something we need to develop reach across the aisle or reach across to your customers or really the people who work for us in Congress to actually develop something like this who don't see eye to eye with you? And what will be your game plan going forward to get there?
So the first one first.
Yeah, let me start with the one about what the French do. The French actually reprocess the fuel that's discharged from their reactors. We used to call it spent fuel. We now call it used fuel because it's not really spent. There's a lot of energy value in it. The French use aqueous technology that's been around for a long time, the Purex process. They recycle their discharge fuel once, and they incorporate the plutonium into mixed uranium plutonium oxide, and burn that in their light water reactors. The waste from the reprocessing is vitrified and will be eventually disposed once they build a site and build their repository.
Yeah, and one more point on that. Bob mentioned the experiment in Nevada, Yucca Mountain, that was the U.S. policy for disposal, direct disposal. There are countries across the globe that are actually moving much faster than we are now on developing a repository. So the Finns, the Swedes are actually moving pretty smartly towards getting a repository developed. So it's not, as Hussein and Bob both alluded to, it's not a technical, it's much more of a socio-political challenge than it is as a geologist, I can tell you we can develop a safe repository. It's just more of a social political challenge. Now, your second question was about how do we engage policymakers, basically, to all these great ideas that we have up here. How do we engage policymakers? Particularly who don't agree necessarily, like say somebody who's anti-nuclear, for example, or whatever. Okay.
Mark, you started this. Let me just quickly finish the idea of a carbon tax. I think I'm going to start actively lobbying for a revenue-neutral carbon tax. I was at the American Nuclear Society meeting a couple of weeks ago, and George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, made a very sort of convincing argument in favor of that. I think that would be a worthwhile policy
Revenue
direction.
technology neutral, and just let's see what happens. Yeah, I think it's the right choice. But so okay. So Bob, engaging policymakers, particularly those who don't agree with you. You've done a lot of that.
So if the the way I would answer it is to say you have to parse time here. If the question, can you do something, say in the next 2 years, during the remainder of the Obama administration, I have a very pessimistic answer. I think the answer is no. And my reason for that is that I think the Republicans are simply unwilling to give the Obama administration any break. They're just going to oppose. And so what we've been seeing in Washington will just continue for the next two years. That's a scenario I offer. I can't give you the probability, but I would say it's pretty likely. Past that, I think things can change. One of the things that I've been particularly interested in is finding Republicans who would support a revenue-neutral carbon tax. And they exist. They tend to be the Republicans that are fiscally conservative, not necessarily socially conservative. And there are ways that have been proposed to structure a revenue tax. One of them involves a reduction in the payroll tax that corresponds to, in a revenue-neutral way, to the increased tax and energy tax. What's particularly interesting about that kind of tax is not only will conservative Republicans, the ones that are on the business end of things, support that, but interestingly enough, the primary beneficiaries in the population will actually be people at the low end of the income spectrum. So there's an attraction actually for Democrats, for liberals as well. But I think to actually get there will require some significant changes in Washington, and we're not going to see that for the next 2 years, unfortunately. That's my sense.
The other comment I would make is that there's clearly a desire, a hunger of policymakers for objective information to inform these decisions, because they typically, in my experience, they typically get visited by the various lobbies that exist. Particularly your energy sector has a lobby, and the coal people are in there, the wind people are in there, solar, nuclear, et cetera. And so when they look at universities and laboratories, I think they view us as potentially carriers of objective information to help inform policy. So they typically will take the meetings if we want to come see them to talk about it from that perspective. But we of course aren't lobbying; we're just providing objective information. Yeah. So there is opportunities.
Yeah. One very interesting change in the Department of Energy that occurred since Ernie Moniz arrived as secretary is that Ernie has substantially increased the policy effort within the Department of Energy. And I view that as a huge positive.
Yeah, that's good.
They've actually stood up an office that is Energy Policy and Systems Analysis Office. It's probably a month or two old at this point, so we'll all be keeping an eye on how that develops.
Right.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have one. Natural gas burns 25% cleaner. We're on this 50-year bridge, but doesn't it leak? And that's one issue. And it's 21 times more damaging for keeping heat on the earth than CO2. And then what if by chance, I heard that the National Science Council just a couple days ago released this idea that global warming could get a whole lot worse. We have this idea, and I think we made this assumption in this meeting, that it's going to go kind of easy, but it could get a whole lot worse. Then what happens?
Do you want me to? I can take that. So the first thing is that there's a sum rule argument, which I will point out. That in fact we know with an absolute level of certainty what the global warming on average is produced by doubling CO2, tripling CO2. So those numbers globally are very well understood, and as I said, they've been basically understood since Arrhenius, because you need a bit of elementary thermodynamics to figure that out. What we don't know, of course, is the local impact of those things, and we also don't know certain effects about ocean uptake of CO2, which is a very poorly understood phenomenon, and various bits and pieces. So I think the issue is if we have a certain level of CO2 in the atmosphere, we know how much warmer it's going to get. What we don't know, in fact, is either the local impact of that about whatever else is happening. But I'm afraid, we get back to policy issues. If you sit here in the United States, you are going to be the last people on the planet who care about doubling of CO2 or tripling of CO2. Other people are going to get much more unhappy about it first. So we will respond more slowly in terms of our policies to CO2 warming than anybody else will. It's a sort of an unfortunate thing about associated with where we live, mid-latitudes, not very much coastline. Do sell your properties in Florida. Because there are a few other things you can predict, like the intensity of hurricanes grows with the fourth power of the temperature of the sea surface. So there are sort of certain bits of physics which are kind of standard. But I don't see in the US any focus whatsoever on global warming as driving policy whatsoever, except for sort of certain blips when hurricanes run up the East Coast. But I think that kind of passes. Okay. And what I would also say is that what we should do for that economically is to mitigate those effects, not to try and fix them. I hate to say that, but actually, if you want to save money, that's what you do.
Does anybody want to comment on leakage?
Yeah.
Leakage?
So leakage is an issue, recently there have been some new discussions about exactly what the leakage rate is, and it looks like the rates were actually underestimated before. So it is a problem, but it's a problem that can be dealt with, and the reason that it's not being dealt with is, unfortunately, that it's again, I hate to say it, it's a policy issue, which is that the fracking technology and all the things that go into extracting natural gas from the ground is simply outside of the regulatory schemes in the United States today. They're not regulated. So as long as that's the case, it's very difficult to force companies to behave well, and that's the fundamental problem.
But it's being looked at by the regulator, and there's people in the room here at the laboratory who are thinking about it.
The key is you need legislation.
Yeah, understood.
And that is the problem.
Yeah, understood. Leakage from the wellhead, leakage of methane from the wellhead, for example. Yeah, from the infrastructure as well. So the point that was made is when you look at greenhouse gases, methane is much more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2.
Per molecule, what you were referring to per molecule, the capacity is about 20 times larger than CO2.
Than CO2. So if you get 3% leakage from the wellhead, it's a big deal. Okay, time for one more question. I apologize, but the hour is dictating that we only take one more.
My question refers to nuclear fusion, in particular ITER experiment in France. And the question is how confident you are that that particular multi-billion experiment will bring us much closer to nuclear fusion.
You get to talk about that.
Yeah, so so I actually have been involved in that. So ITER, the international, it's an international collaboration. The best thing you can say about it is that it's amazingly good at consuming large amounts of money. Just to give you a feeling what I mean by that, the original cost was about $5 billion, and today it's 26, 27 billion and counting. Okay, it's a factor of 5 plus overrun, cost overrun. One of the issues, so now I have to tell you something technical, and I apologize for that, but it's a key to the answer to your question. The kind of reactor, fusion reactor it is, which is a tokamak, it's basically a donut. That technology is known to have a stability problem. There's a particular instability called the sawtooth instability, which occurs when you drive the current in the torus hard enough. And you can ask, in order for them to approach break even, not from the external point of view, but at least from the point of view of what happens in the fusion chamber, it turns out that the current density has to be above the threshold for this instability. So it's very likely that they will very rarely ever go into that regime, because when the instability happens, the plasma hits the walls and basically destroys the inner wall. So the problem is it was a very ambitious experiment that's probably premature. And one sign of the recognition of the plasma community is that they understand this, is that the Germans are building a very different kind of device called a stellarator. It's basically a twisted figure 8 in Greifswald in the north of Germany, which is about a $2 or $3 billion experiment, which is a very different kind of fusion device. And they're plowing ahead because it's very likely that they will not be limited by this instability. That geometry is not susceptible to the sawtooth instability. So somebody joked about fusion always being 50 years in the future. I can't say I disagree with that.
Yeah, that was my only joke of the night, I think. I've heard a few laughs. Okay, so with that, I want to thank the panel. Fantastic panel, I think. Thank the audience and thank the university for again sponsoring this.